Go ahead. Good. All right, let's go ahead and review the concept of call to write. So we've talked about this before in at least two other lessons, but basically the call to write is what influences the author to write what they write, what's going on in and around the author when they choose to write this text. For this story, the call to write is somewhat historical, social, cultural, all of that going on. So the story was written in 1948. It's 3 years after the end of World War II. So even though World War II ended in 1945, a lot of servicemen were still working overseas, helping to sort of rebuild what they could, and dealing with sort of leftover skirmishes, establishing a regular police force, that kind of thing. So it's around about this time that the men are finally starting to come home. If you read Women in Work after World War II, you know that World War II really changed things for American women. So you may have seen images of Rosie the Riveter, for example. Here actually is a copy of that iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. And basically, this image was a call to arms to American women. And it was like, all the men are going overseas. It is your patriotic duty to go to work. And so women went into the factories, and they went into the factories where people were making automobiles and products that we sort of already had on the market, but they also went into factories and into other jobs that were needed specifically for the war effort. So there were women who made bombs, for example. There were women who were entering what was like the earlier versions of the CIA, becoming spies and things like that. So women, they go out, they go to work, and they realize that they really like having their own money, and being able to set some of their own rules. In this time period, you see women starting to do things that they haven't really done before, a little bit more drinking, a little bit more smoking. They put off having children and things like that because they really like being independent. So during World War II, they get this new sense of independence. But immediately after World War II, the men come back, and women are told now that it's their patriotic duty to leave the factories and all the other jobs where they have been making their own money and go back home. That their jobs as women of the nation are to go home and provide this nice, comfortable space for men to come home to, and to vacate jobs so that those men have jobs to come home to when they come back, right? Basically, there's this idea that you're holding on to a job that really belongs to a man. And some women really were not happy with the situation. Like I said, they enjoyed making their own money. They enjoyed having a sense of independence. And so there was a little pushback from that. And then what you see in the late 1940s and throughout all of the 1950s is this strong push towards traditionalism. This push towards traditionalism was reflected in the pop culture of the time. So at this time period, you start seeing shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, and the women are all dressed in dresses with pearls, and they're cooking and cleaning and vacuuming while they're wearing their pearls. You can see this in advertisements. A lot of the advertisements targeted towards women were for domestic things like, vacuum cleaners and things like that. So women, and especially middle class white women, fulfill their patriotic duty and they go back to the home. This is also the era of the baby boomer generation. So here are all these women who are used to doing lots of things, running a home and working perhaps with all this time on their hands, and they go home, and the way they sort of fill up that time now is to have a bunch of babies. And so you probably have heard lots of things about the baby boomer generation. That baby boomer generation grew up in the 1950s. Women with nothing else to do had a bunch of babies because they weren't allowed to work. That's basically what happened. Okay, so how do we see the call to write reflected in the text itself? One of the ways that we see this push towards traditionalism reflected in the text is through the use of the third person objective narrator. We know that the lottery is tradition, but we don't know why it's tradition. We don't know what the goal is. And the same is true for sort of traditional values about gender in the home. Why was it that men were supposed to work and women were supposed to stay home? Explain that to me. Where do you get that justification from? And if you asked most people of the time, and if you ask most people of this time why that is, most of them will shrug and just say, that's just the way it is. That's the way it's always been. And so this lack of understanding is reflected in the third person objective narrator. We also see an obsession with tradition reflected in things like the ceremony of the lottery itself and the black box. So let's take a look at that in the text. So this is page 2 of the text. If you have a print copy, maybe pull it out and take a look at it. Otherwise, maybe just follow along. In the very first paragraph, you see a description of the box itself. So if you look at the very top, it says, "The black box, now resting on the stool, had been in use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present black box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, and that the one that had been constructed when the first people settled and made a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything's having been done. The black box grew shabbier every year, and by now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, in some places faded or stained." So we're getting a couple of things here. First of all, we already talked about how the black box represents tradition and how outside of the ceremony, it really has no value. It's left in a barn sometimes. It's left in the post office underfoot sometimes. It doesn't really seem to have any real value. We also see that our symbol of tradition is splintered, badly splintered on one side. So the tradition is starting to fall apart in some ways, in part because this tradition no longer serves the society that continues to engage in it. If you look at the last paragraph, it begins to read, "There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time. Until now, it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching." So here you see that our tradition has started to kind of fall apart. People have forgotten what to do, in part because they also do not know why they do what they do. And it's also kind of interesting to note that what the author seems to be saying here is that it's normal for traditions to grow, to adapt, to change over time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The last way we see this call to write reflected in the text is through the stoning of Tess Hutchinson. Notice that the character to get stoned here is a woman. So here we see that theme of gender coming into play. Not only that, but Tess Hutchinson is characterized as sort of a bad woman. She shows up late to the lottery. She is sort of loud and obnoxious. She's so loud that she interrupts the officials up front. Mr. Summers says, "I thought we'd have to start without you, Tessie." And she sort of jokes back, "You wouldn't have me leave my dirty dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And the whole, and everybody around her kind of laughs. So here she is undermining the seriousness of the situation, especially considering that somebody's going to end up dead at the end of it. Then later, when her husband is revealed to be the one who has drawn the spot, the black spot, she actually mentions her daughter Ava. She says, "Hey, there's my daughter Ava. She should take her turn too." Ava is her grown daughter who has married into another family. Married women draw with their husband's family. So basically, she's offering up her daughter to be a part of the sacrifice, hoping that maybe her daughter will get the black spot instead of her. Again, that makes her a bad mother, a bad woman. At one point, when her husband reveals that he has the black spot, she says, "It wasn't fair. You didn't let him pick the one he really wanted." And he tells her to shut up. And I think that that is one of those really interesting moments in the story, because it, it sort of implies that she is, again, a bad wife. She's embarrassing him. She's not playing by the rules. And women who don't play by the rules get punished. And they get punished, in this case, with death. So this is the end of our discussion of the lottery.